Good afternoon and welcome. We're going to get started here today. Thank you for coming over here. I know this isn't our usual place, and so we know that some of you might have gone over to the other place and then come over here, and just that means you got more steps in today. So we apologize for that, but we really appreciate you finding us here. My name is Deborah Gonzalez, and I'm the Vice President of Government Affairs for the Public Policy Institute of California, or PPIC, and I want to thank you for joining us here in this beautiful space, the Stanley Moss Library and Courts Building. And for those of you who are not familiar with PPIC, we're a nonprofit with offices both in Sacramento and in San Francisco. And for today's presentation, we're going to hear from our latest survey on Californians and their government. Oh, sure. I might not be speaking close enough to it. Sorry. This survey was supported with funding from the R.J. and Francis F. Miller Foundation, the James Irvine Foundation, and the PPIC Donor Circle. And we'd like to appreciate them and thank them for their support of this research. We'd like to also acknowledge the PPIC Corporate Circle and the PPIC Donor Circle for the support of this lunch and the event. So I hope you got, the beer bread followed us, so that was the good news. We're excited about that. At registration, you should have received a document that contains some findings, key findings from the survey. The full survey and the crosstabs and time trends of adults and likely voters are, as well as the slide from today's presentation, are now available online at ppic.org. After the presentation, you should have plenty of time for question and answer, and we would hope that you would wait till the microphones come, because as you know, microphones are important here because we are recording this for an audience. On February 27th, we will be over at the Capitol Event Center for an event on fiscal challenges of declining enrollment in California schools, featuring a presentation on a new PPIC report, as well as a great panel of experts. So I hope you'll join us. You may sign up online and attend in person, but we will also broadcast that as usual. Later today, you'll receive a survey, yes, from our survey team. They love to do surveys. We appreciate when you fill those out. We actually do read them, and we really learn a lot from your comments. Finally, please turn off your cell phones. So I was looking at my calendar today, and I was driving through my neighbor, and I saw just a couple of presidential signs, not a lot. It was kind of surprising when I figured out we only have about 11 days to the presidential primary. I know, it seems crazy. It suffices to say this is our last survey before the March primary. The number of candidates in the Democratic primary, the debate schedule, and the rule changes made it very challenging for our team to figure out who to survey on. So we really want to put a shout out to y'all because we know that was very difficult. And Dean, our presenter, will talk a little bit about that process and why people were in the poll and not in the poll. And while the primary is very important, there are some other important issues highlighted in the survey. The March ballot will also have a school bond, the largest school bond in California history, on the ballot. The overall numbers look really close. It's just getting a slim majority. But if you assume a Democrat turnout is high because of the Democrat primary, the bond looks like it stands a better chance. And interesting, the climate bond that the governor proposed in his January budget actually has more support, even though it hasn't actually been fleshed out yet and isn't on the ballot until November. There is, again, bipartisan agreement that homelessness is a big problem, and if you watch the governor's State of the State this week, the legislature and the governor recognizing this as a big public priority. Crime is also a concern in the survey, and we have a series of questions on crime and the perception of policing in California. The responses are complex, and while there is some bipartisan agreement, there are some important differences among racial groups. This is where I want to again put a plug in for our crosstabs, which are always online. And they show some really interesting information and trends, particularly by region and race. And for Alexia and my census team at PPIC, I wanted to highlight that 80% of likely voters thought that participating in the upcoming census is going to be very important. Unfortunately, only 67% of all respondents thought so. And so since the census counts everyone, it's really important that there's more work to be done here. That's what I think this highlights for us. So now with that, I'd like to welcome our colleague, PPIC Associate Survey Director and Research Fellow, Dean Bonner, who will present the findings of the survey. And thank you.
Thank you all for being here, and of course, thank Deborah for her great introduction, as always. gets. Lift it up a little bit. There we go. All right. So by providing timely, relevant, and nonpartisan data on important topics, the PPIC statewide survey provides a voice for all Californians and likely voters. It's part of our kind of mission to make sure that we're talking to not only likely voters or registered voters, but all Californians, because so much policy is made at the ballot box, but it's also important to consider how overall Californians feel about some of these very critical issues. Our survey seeks to inform policymakers, encourage discussion, and raise awareness on critical issues. And since 1998, we've completed almost 200 surveys and have given a voice to over 370,000 Californians in doing so. So this general survey series, the Californians in Their Government series, is funded, as Deborah said, by the RJ and Francis F. Miller Foundation, the James Irvine Foundation, and the PPIC Donor Circle. For this particular poll, we surveyed about 1,700 Californians on landline and cell phones from February 7th to 17th. So if you're kind of thinking, yes, that was the New Hampshire primary was kind of in the middle of that, so there was that effect as well. We called folks, 75% of folks on cell phones and 25% on landlines, which is a little bit of a bump from last year. And the margin of error overall for all adults is 3.4%, and for likely voters, it's 4.4%. And I'll talk a good bit about what we're calling Democratic primary likely voters. And it's important to realize that the margin of error for that group is 5.7%. So when we're talking about some of these findings, because it's, we're talking, I think, just over, or 573 Democratic primary likely voters. So it's just a larger margin of error to consider when we're looking at some of these items. In this survey, we take a look at both the the national election and the policy landscape, as well as the state election and the policy landscape. At the national level, of course, we take a look at the 2020 Democratic primary. We also look at approval rating of federal elected officials. We look at the importance of voting in 2020 and the importance of participating in the census. And at the state level, we take a look at Proposition 13, which is on the March ballot, not that Proposition 13, but this Proposition 13, which I will have to say, listening to people respond to questions as we do periodically, there were a lot of people who were like, I like Proposition 13, but no, not that one. And so it will be challenging as people go to the polls to kind of see if there's any kind of confusion on that matter. We also look at approval of state elected officials, housing affordability, and homelessness. And as Deborah mentioned, the kind of intersection of crime, local police, and racial ethnic groups there as well. So in our final survey before the March 3rd primary, Bernie Sanders has emerged from what was a group of 3 frontrunners in recent months, and now leads his competition by more than a 2-to-1 margin. Democratic primary likely voters. So let's talk about this group for a while. These are likely voters who are registered Democrats or likely voters who are registered as MPP but told us on the phone that they would choose to vote in the Democratic primary. So when we asked independents, about a third said that they would choose to vote in the Democratic primary. And if you've been kind of following this, it is a challenging issue. There has been a lot of confusion about it. The Secretary of State has really had a fairly good information campaign as of late, explaining to people there's a new law which will make kind of changing your ballot easier. But it's definitely something to consider as people are going to the polls. So what we find with Sanders' support is that he has double-digit leads among younger Californians, 18 to 44, he's plus 40 among that group. Among Latinos, where he's plus 35, as well as among men and women. The race is much closer among likely voters 45 and up and among white likely voters. And since January, the race has really evolved a bit, as I mentioned, with Sanders going up 5 points, Biden going down 10 points, Elizabeth Warren going down 10 points, and kind of the entrance of Michael Bloomberg into the race, which if you compare to our January survey, he's up 11 points, but I'll use this time to talk a little bit about the fact that this is the first time that Michael Bloomberg has actually been a named candidate in our surveys. So with the turn of the calendar year, we had a kind of a little bit of a winnowing of the field. And what we did for this survey is basically at the beginning of the survey period listed 12 names or read 12 names to folks, and then they could also name other people as well. During the fielding period, we had a total of 4 people drop out from the race, but luckily enough, we also asked people what their second choice was. And so with that information, we were able to kind of reallocate those who said they were voting for Yang or Bennett or Delaney to their with their second choice. And so we weren't really losing a lot of people with that. Prior surveys, we used the protocol of if you were going to be on an upcoming debate, then we included you. But we felt after our January survey and given the short period of time and kind of a more condensed list that using kind of what the national polls were including, which ended up being the same 12 names in pretty much every national poll that the DNC approves in the lead up to our survey. So we used those 12 to begin with, and as people dropped out, we just pulled them from the list of red names. And so we also wanted to get an idea of how Californians are feeling about not only their vote preference, but also who they feel has the best chance to beat Donald Trump in November. And what we found this month is that Bernie Sanders, not only being the top preference, he's also viewed as the top choice to beat who has the best chance to beat Donald Trump in November. 16% name Joe Biden as having that best chance, and 16% also named Bloomberg. Since since January, what we've seen with this question is that Bernie Sanders has seen an increase of 9 points, but the biggest change here is that Joe Biden has dropped 30 points on this question since our January survey, when 46% of Democratic primary likely voters were saying that he had the best chance. Sanders is viewed as having the best chance among younger Californians, among Latinos, among men, and among women. So the same group that where he garners a lot of his support from, are also the ones who are saying he has the best chance. And with electability on a lot of people's minds when it comes to this election, we wanted to kind of get an idea of how people were approaching this. And when we asked Democratic primary likely voters if they would prefer the Democrats nominate a candidate who they thought had the best chance to beat Donald Trump, or whose stance on issues were more aligned, we find that Democratic likely voters think it's more important that Democrats nominate a candidate who has the best chance to beat Donald Trump, rather than those who has positions who may align with them. Preference for Democrats to nominate someone who can beat Trump is wildly held. And in fact, across regions and demographic groups, only among this younger group of California likely voters were they more likely to say stance on issue is more important than electability. And so it's a very important kind of concept here as we go to the polls, but it's widely held among this group that pretty much most people want someone who can beat Trump, and they're less concerned with kind of where the kind of nitty-gritty comes down to on issues. So turning from the election to elected officials, in the wake of his acquittal by the Senate, we find a record share of Californians approve of President Trump, 35%. His approval is highly partisan, but it's important to note that his approval only eclipses 50% among any of our regional or demographic groups among Republicans. So it's kind of a widely held belief there. And there's a 20-point gap between men and women, with just 1 in 4 women saying that they approve of Donald Trump. When we look at Congress, we find their approval of Congress is at its highest point since December 2009, but fewer than half across parties, regions, and demographic groups approve. So that's also kind of in the wake of the impeachment process, which, depending on kind of how you feel about the process itself, you could kind of find good things on either side. So seeing approval of Congress a little higher than we have as of late. And when we look at approval of a respondent's own representative, it's at its highest point since January 2015, and it's lowest among Republicans at 34%, other Orange San Diego counties at 46%, and among whites at 48%. California's U.S. senators both have the approval of about half of Californians. Beyond the evident partisan divide, approval is higher in the San Francisco Bay Area and in Los Angeles. It makes sense considering their kind of Democratic strongholds. Women are more likely to approve of both senators than men. And while approval for each senator is similar across demographic groups, it is notable that Dianne Feinstein's approval among African Americans is 12 points higher than Harris's approval among the same group. So that was somewhat noteworthy. So given that the U.S. Senate decided to not remove President Trump from office, we wanted to kind of gauge how Californians feel about this. And what we find is that nearly 6 in 10 Californians think that the Senate should have decided to remove Donald Trump from office. Not surprisingly, Republicans are against this, while Democrats were in favor of this. We also find that independents are divided on this. And these findings are somewhat similar to other questions we've asked in the lead up during the impeachment process. At least half across regions think that the Senate should have removed him from office. And this perception is held by at least 2 in 3 among African Americans, Asian Americans, and Latinos, while a slim majority of whites think that he should not have been removed from office. While it's not surprising, support for removing Donald Trump from office declines with rising income and is higher among younger Californians than older ones. It is notable that about 6 in 10 across education groups think that he should have been removed from office. So there are these kind of demographic differences, but when it comes to education, it's fairly stable across our education groups. So in the wake of this divisive impeachment process and an ever-growing kind of hyper-partisanship, what we're seeing is that Californians are now divided on the question of whether or not Americans of different political views can come together and work out their differences. This marks a decline in optimism from a year ago, and that survey, it should be noted, was taken on the heels of one of the longest, if not the longest, government shutdowns. And so at that point, you were kind of in an area where there was a lot of back and forth among Americans of different political views. Republicans are more likely than Democrats, and what we've seen since last year, optimism is up 6 points among Republicans, and while optimism among Democrats has declined 11 points. At least half of residents in the Central Valley, the Inland Empire, and Los Angeles are optimistic, while at least half of residents in San Francisco Bay Area and Orange San Diego are pessimistic. Nearly 6 in 10 Latinos are nearly 6 in 10 Latinos are optimistic, while about half in other racial ethnic groups are actually pessimistic. And what we've seen is that since 2017, when we first asked this question, we've seen a decline in optimism of 23 points among African Americans, 17 points among Asian Americans, 7 points among whites, and while among Latinos, it's pretty much exactly the same. What we also see is that optimism declines with higher education and income. So this is something that we hope to track as we go into the election process, because it's something that I think is, this along with trust is kind of when it comes down to a democracy, has a very core value that people can come together and just make decisions and decide policy that's beneficial for everyone. So it's something we're definitely going to track. So as Deborah mentioned, we asked about the census, and 2020 is a big year because of the presidential election and because of the census. And we asked about each of these. Californians are more likely to say that voting in elections in 2020 is very important than participating in the 2020 census. This higher level of importance is seen across political, regional, and demographic groups, with at least 3 in 4 calling voting in 2020 very important. When we look at the same groups, about 2 in 3 or more across these groups say that participating in the census is very important. And when it comes to census participation, it's notable that US-born Californians are less likely than foreign-born Californians to call the census very important. This isn't something that we see when it comes to voting. It's pretty similar across groups when it comes to voting in 2020. So beyond just the importance of participating, we wanted to have a gauge of how likely it is that Californians actually do participate in the census. And what we find is that overall, about 2 in 3 Californians say that they will definitely participate, and another 1 in 5 say that they will probably participate. This is similar to what the Pew Research Center found in a recent poll, where 67% of Americans said they would definitely participate, and 18% said they would probably participate. Older Californians are much more likely than younger Californians to say they would participate, and while US-born Californians are less likely than non-citizens to say that participation is very important, what we find is that they are more likely than non-citizens to say they will definitely participate. And this is something that's likely being driven by the discussion around including a citizenship question, as well as concerns about confidentiality among some of these groups. We also find that whites and African Americans are more likely than Asian Americans and Latinos to say that they will definitely participate. And this finding is also likely being driven by US-born versus immigrant populations when it comes to some of the concerns I just talked about. And the share saying that they will definitely participate in the census increases with education and income levels. But overall, there's a lot of solid majorities in most groups are saying that they're definitely going to participate. So now shifting over to the state section, we definitely wanted to, as we have been, continue to track Proposition 13. And what we're finding this month is that after being read a ballot label and summary, which mentions that the fiscal impacts are increased state costs to repay bonds that are estimated at about $740 million per year, including interest, over the next 35 years, we find that 51% of likely voters say they would vote yes, 42% would vote no. It's important to consider kind of what voters are actually going to see when they go to the ballot. So that's why we include the full ballot label and summary. That includes this LAO analysis, which could be, impacting the way that people feel about this. If you see, wow, 35 years for that much money, it perhaps could lead you to either be undecided or to be more likely to vote no. what we see is that 7 in 10 Democrats are in favor, 7 in 10 Republicans are against it, while independents are divided. Across regions, majorities in Los Angeles and the San Francisco Bay Area are in favor, and about 4 in 10 elsewhere support the bond. Younger and less affluent likely voters would vote yes, while about half across education groups support the bond. And when we look at renters and homeowners, it shouldn't be surprising that 2 in 3 renters support the bond compared to about half of homeowners, considering that property taxes are involved in some of this as well. So looking at the approval ratings of state electeds, it is interesting that about half of Californians approve of Governor Newsom, the California legislature, and their own legislators. I say it's interesting because when you look at, these are basically the same folks who put Proposition 13 on the ballot via AB 48, and so there's kind of this, about half of Californians approving of this in general. This is a record high for Governor Newsom, and it's the highest approval of the legislature in 2 years. I should note that the record high for Newsom is just a 2-point bump from last month, and given that's really early in his tenure, I'm sure as things go out, there'll be a lot of fluctuation. Approval of Newsom is being driven by divided partisans and independents who themselves are divided. About 6 in 10 in San Francisco Bay Area and Los Angeles approve, while just under half approve elsewhere. Women are much more likely to approve of Newsom, and whites are much less likely than those in other racial ethnic groups to approve. When we look at approval of the legislature, it follows a similar pattern to approval of Newsom, but approval is actually higher in the San Francisco Bay Area than elsewhere, and the gender gap is less wide when it comes to the legislature, with women slightly less likely to approve of the state legislature. And regarding approval of their own legislatures, we find that similar as well, but it's notable that at least half across regions approve of their own legislators. So that's the kind of regional difference goes away when you ask people about their own legislators. And that's something that we found consistently in the past, where overall people, when you ask about bigger bodies, whether it be Congress or the legislature, there's more of an affinity to your own representative, especially if it's a situation where your own rep is a member of the party or the belief system that you kind of follow. So as Deborah mentioned, we also asked about a couple of the proposals that Governor Newsom mentioned during his budget proposal. One being placing a $4.7 billion bond to address climate risk, and the other spending $1 billion to address homelessness. Both of these proposals received positively by Californians and likely voters. And as you might expect, there's a partisan divide on both of these, although Republicans are slightly more likely to favor spending on homelessness than addressing climate change. About 6 in 10 independents say they would support both of these proposals. In both cases, support among whites, while still the majority, is less than among other racial ethnic groups. And there is majority support across regions for both of these proposals, and in both cases, support declines with rising age and income, a consistent and familiar refrain. And I should note that, assuming that the climate resiliency bond, or whatever it's going to be called, is continued to move forward, that's something that we'll definitely continue to track, as well as homelessness, which we'll see we've really, given the importance of the issue that Californians are placing on it and the governor, it's an issue that we'll continue to track as well. So what we find is that a solid majority of Californians continue to call housing affordability in their part of California a big problem. Last March, this number was 68%, so it's fairly similar to what it was last March. And although one might not expect it, there's a partisan divide on problem seriousness of housing affordability, with 3 in 4 Democrats and 6 in 10 independents saying it's a big problem compared to fewer than half Republicans. Across regions, it's not surprising that the affordability of housing is most likely to be called a big problem in the San Francisco Bay Area. I can attest to that. As someone whose house or building is currently up for sale, it's definitely an issue that resonates in my home. Majorities across demographic groups say it's a big problem, but this perception increases with education level and is higher among renters than among homeowners. This is one of my favorite questions here because it really gets at a lot of issues that California is dealing with now. And so when we ask people if the cost of housing is making them seriously consider moving away from their part of California, we find that 44% say that they have considered this, with most who say they have considered it saying that they would move outside the state. Younger Californians and those without college degrees are more likely than others to hold this view. And illustrating how widely this belief is held, at least 4 in 10 across gender, racial ethnic groups, and income groups say they have considered moving. Among those who call housing affordability a big problem, 55% say that they are considering moving. And among those who call it somewhat of a problem, just 30% say this. And among the group that say that housing affordability is not a problem, just 12% say that they are considering moving. And a lot of what we see here regarding younger people, less affluent and less educated, kind of matches up with what we see from the census when we look at kind of who's actually moving out of the state. And so we've seen this year after year over the last 3 or 4 years where it's kind of less affluent and less educated folks leaving out of the state and kind of more educated people coming into the state. And so our data here kind of matches up with that. Oops, sorry about that. Okay, yes. So similar to housing affordability, a solid majority of Californians say that homelessness is a big problem in their part of California. Views were similar last May when 63% said that this was a big problem. We find that majorities across regions call homelessness a big problem, with this perception slightly higher in Los Angeles and the San Francisco Bay Area. Similar to housing affordability, Republicans are less likely than Democrats and independents to view this as a big problem. 3 in 4 African Americans call homelessness a big problem, compared to about 6 in 10 Asians and Latinos, and 55% of white Californians. And about 6 in 10 across age, education, and income groups say that homelessness is a big problem. So this is consistent with what we found in the past. This is a very widely held view that homelessness is a huge problem. In January, it was the top issue that people named as regarding what the governor and the state legislature should work on, and given the amount of time that Governor Newsom spent on it on Monday, Tuesday, I don't know, this week it's been a little bit of a crazy week, but earlier this week in his State of the State, he spent a significant amount of time on the issue of homelessness. And one potential way to address the homelessness issue was raised by Governor Newsom's task force on homeless recently, when they recommended a measure be placed on the November ballot that would amend the state constitution and mandate that cities, counties, and states provide enough housing or shelter to put every homeless person under a roof. 6 in 10 Californians and 55% of likely voters say they would vote yes on this measure. 7 in 10 Democrats and 6 in 10 independents would vote yes, compared to about 1 in 3 Republicans. More than 8 in 10 African Americans and Latinos and 6 in 10 Asian Americans would vote yes, compared to just under half of white Californians who say they would vote yes. And support for this potential measure on the ballot is much higher among women than among men, and much higher among renters than among homeowners. And support for this potential constitutional amendment declines as age, education, and income levels increase. So this is another one that, assuming that it moves forward and is potentially going to be on the ballot in November, this will be one that we hopefully will be able to continue to track as well. So upon taking office, Governor Newsom made the decision to scale back the HighSpeed Rail project and complete the construction underway for a high-speed rail from Bakersfield to Merced, while continuing to plan and look for money to do kind of the rest of the proposed high-speed rail project. Half of Californians say this is a good idea, while 4 in 10 say it's a bad idea. And when asked a similar question last year, 53% held this view. This is a kind of a tricky question because folks saying bad idea aren't necessarily saying that the scaling back is a bad idea. There are a subsegment of people that are saying that the high-speed rail more generally is a bad idea. And so we hope in the coming months to be able to spend some time on this regarding kind of looking more into this. And what we see is that a majority of Democrats are calling it a good idea, while half of independents and nearly 3 in 4 Republicans call it a bad idea. Despite, or perhaps because of, the high-speed rail plan is now focused in the Central Valley, we see that half of residents in that region call it a bad idea, while about half elsewhere call it a good idea. And we find that about 6 in 10 African Americans and Latinos call it a good idea, compared to about half of Asian Americans and 4 in 10 whites who call it a good idea. And so this is something that we've pretty much tracked over time every March or February for the last, I want to say, probably about 5 years, whether it be approval of the overall system or approval of this type of question. And pretty much overall, about half of Californians have pretty consistently said they either favor the idea of high-speed rail or they think it's a good idea or something like that. So it's definitely an issue that kind of divides the state, indeed. And speaking of issues that divide the state, water, since the birth of California, has pretty much played an important role in dividing folks. And in this case, we wanted to get another read on a plan that Governor Newsom has moved forward with. His decision to change from what Jerry Brown wanted, which was 2 tunnels, and scale back to have 1 tunnel in the Delta. This plan is better received with nearly 6 in 10 saying that they think it's a good idea. Last year, 52% called it a good idea, so it's up slightly, ever so slightly. 6 in 10 Democrats and half of independents think this is a good idea, while nearly half of Republicans think this is a bad idea. About 6 in 10 residents in Los Angeles, Orange, San Diego, the Inland Empire, and the San Francisco Bay Area call it a good idea, compared to about half in the Central Valley. Once again, majorities of Latinos, Asian Americans, and African Americans are calling this a good idea, compared to just 4 in 10 whites. And at least half across age, education, and income groups say that this is a good idea. Water is something, especially with the developments that occurred this week, that we'll definitely be coming back to hopefully soon. And we hopefully during the summer we can spend some more time on this as well, because it's a hugely important issue. So another problem seriousness question that we asked was about how much of a problem is violence and street crime in your local community. And we see that 1 in 4 Californians are calling this a big problem, and just under 4 in 10 call it somewhat of a problem. Dating in surveys back to 2011, between 1 in 5 and pretty much 1 in 4 have said that violence and street crime is a big problem, so it really hasn't changed much over time. Today, African Americans and Latinos are more likely than Asian Americans and whites to call this a big problem. And the view that crime is a problem is more common in the Central Valley than in other regions. And when we look at kind of education and income, we see that college graduates and those with higher incomes are less likely than others to call this a big problem. So we also wanted to gauge kind of how folks are feeling about their local police. And when it comes to rating their local police, about 1 in 4 say that their local police are doing an excellent job, and 4 in 10 say they're doing a good job. And in periodic surveys dating back to 2015, findings have been pretty stable over time. White Californians are more likely than those in other racial ethnic groups to rate the police as excellent or good. And majorities across regions, age, education, and income groups say that local police are doing an excellent or good job. So it's a widely held belief that at least, when you kind of bring these two categories together, the majority is saying they're doing an excellent or good job. On the contentious issue of police treatment of racial and ethnic groups, nearly 2 in 3 Californians say that the police in their community treat all racial ethnic groups fairly, either most of the time, almost always, or volunteer that they always treat them fairly. And views were nearly identical on this question last May. There's a wide divide, however, among racial ethnic groups, with African Americans much less likely than others to say that they're treated fairly. The other racial ethnic groups are treated fairly, with just 6% saying that racial ethnic groups are treated fairly always, almost always, or volunteer always. Of course, there's a partisan divide on this as well, with 8 in 10 Republicans compared to about 6 in 10 Democrats and half of independents saying that treatment of racial ethnic groups is fair. And regionally, majorities say that their local police treat all racial ethnic groups fairly. So it's pretty widely held that that the treatment is either fair almost always or most of the time. So to wrap up, Bernie Sanders now leads all the other candidates by about a 2-to-1 margin, and is also, in a change from January, viewed as the most likely to defeat Donald Trump in November. We see that approval of President Trump and of Congress remains low, while about half of Californians approve of their own representative and their two U.S. senators. Overwhelming majorities view participating in the U.S. Census as very important, and voting is very important. And strong majorities say they will definitely participate in the U.S. Census, but there's important differences across racial ethnic groups and age groups, as well as groups across citizenship status. A slim majority of likely voters say that they will support Proposition 13 on the March ballot. And when we look at the state elected officials, we find that slim majorities approve of the governor, the state legislature, and their own representatives in the legislature. Solid majorities see housing affordability and homelessness as a problem in their part of California, and housing costs are making more than 4 in 10 across regions seriously consider moving California. And these two issues are really driving a lot of the debate that's happening here in Sacramento, and will be ones that we continue to follow. At this point, I want to open it up for questions, with the reminder that if we could just wait for someone to bring a microphone, that would be great.
Thanks. Hi, thanks for that. I was wondering on the climate bond findings, did you, maybe I missed it, but is there a breakdown for what the age response was? Did you find a big difference between how young people responded to that versus more older Californians?
I have that, of course, but I just have that support declines with rising age. But I'm pretty sure that it's still, even among the older groups, that it's still either at a majority or close to a majority. And so it is a view that's pretty widely held, definitely.
Just a suggestion on maybe ways to phrase the high-speed rail question in the future. So I think the administration would not even agree that their proposal is to scale back, despite what the governor said last year. I think the real issue right now is going forward with the proposal to build in the Central Valley versus the Assembly proposal, which is to do a lot more building in the Bay Area and Los Angeles and have a diesel train instead of electric. So those are kind of the competing visions. It'd be interesting to see polling on that.
Yeah, definitely.
Actually, someone on a similar track, and I rarely ask questions at these events, but on both high-speed rail and Delta tunnels, you use Governor Newsom's name. Mm-hmm. And actually, he's done kind of a more conservative approach by scaling back both of them. From a pollster perspective, do you think that actually has affected the results? Because you said that Republicans were more skeptical, and I just have to think right away that just using Gavin Newsom automatically reduces Republican support of scaling back proposals that are generally unpopular already among the public.
That's a fair point, I think, but I think he's, especially when we first asked these questions last year, it was a very prominent part of what he was putting forth as his vision for the future. And so I think when we were looking at asking these questions this year, we didn't necessarily want to lose kind of what we had from last year. And so it's always tricky when you've asked questions in the past to kind of see. But I do think that, it's kind of less of something that he's kind of really, moving. He's still moving forward with it, but it's not as prominent in what he's talking about, obviously, with homelessness, housing, and some of the education stuff being much more at the forefront. So that's definitely fair.
More of a statement than a question, I suppose, but I was initially a little concerned when I saw your polling numbers for Proposition 13 showing it at just a bare majority. But then I recalled that at the last statewide school facilities bond, I think it was in 2016, your pre-election poll had that also actually just above like 45%, a couple weeks out from the election. So elections change things, and obviously these polls are a snapshot in time.
Yeah, and it's tough when you still have, I think it's 8% who are undecided, and obviously everyone on election day will have made a decision. But yeah, it's definitely 2 weeks out. There really hasn't been at least that I've seen, a big campaign push for it necessarily. I don't watch a whole lot of TV, but when I do, it's mostly Bloomberg ads. And so, but I'm sure maybe I'll start to see Prop 13 ads as well. And I'll be interested to see how they frame that when they're talking about Proposition 13.
Thanks. That's very interesting, and the persistence of the partisan divide, across every question, is something I think we should all worry about. I had similar concerns about introducing Newsom's name. It seems like regardless of the policy, that question is probably more about whether you like Gavin Newsom or not. And then the other thing was when you talk about rail or tunnels and you're talking about scaling back as opposed to supporting, it's almost a double negative. And do you find that people understand that you're asking about, do you favor scaling these back, or do they think that you're asking about, do you favor tunnels or rail?
We listened to a number of calls in the lead up to the survey going live, and actually on the first night of the survey, and there are questions where you hear kind of like, are people, with this, there wasn't really any concerns, I don't think, but it is often, you do have to be careful about the way you're phrasing things, especially in surveys around the kind of double negative. But I think we didn't hear anything that gave us pause, either last year or this year, so I think it was clear, but you kind of can never tell, I suppose. Yes.
Bouncing off of that, do you guys ever do experimental designs? Because it would be really interesting to do both of those questions to half of the sample and take out the Newsom queue and see what the support is for the proposal absent the partisan queue.
Yeah, it's not something that we're doing at this time, mainly because of the cost of surveying and the fact that if we were to, say, split it, then the sample that you're left with either side, you're not able to take as deep of a dive. Perhaps in the future when we're, if we were to kind of change the format in which we do polling, perhaps there would be more bandwidth there to do those types of things where everyone would get both questions per se at different points in the survey or something like that. But yeah, there's lots of research done on kind of experimental designs around these things. Super interesting, but we're already having to make tough choices around like, oh, should we ask about this? And so, yeah, but I'm right there with you with the interested nature of it. Yes, ma'am?
Hi, in response to Prop 13 and no advertising about it, I just thought I'd let you know that the League of Women Voters is supporting it. But my real question is, when you said you make these calls to cell phones and landlines, how does it show up on your phone? Because I never answer my landline.
That's a great question. I think part of that would depend on what your carrier. And I do know that I recently saw on Twitter someone said that they actually took our survey, which I was very thankful for, but that it did show up as a Sacramento number because we call from California numbers, but he did say that it showed up as a scam likely, which is unfortunate and something I will kind of be monitoring and tracking. But in this day and age, it's really tough because of the amount of robocalls that are just flooding everyone's lines, and the fact that we're already calling 75% of cell phones, where people are kind of less likely to pick up your cell phone potentially, and so it's a ever-growing and challenging issue when you're talking about RDD phone polling, and so it's definitely a challenge.
Hi, with regard to your question about the support for homelessness measures, was there any question associated with the actual housing status of the participants who are being contacted or in relation to political party?
So you're wondering if we asked people what their kind of, what their living situation was? For lack of a better word? No, we did not. It would be interesting. Obviously, it's a very small group, I think. We'll wait and see what the numbers say, but I'm not sure what share of folks would actually, it would be interesting, but I'm just not sure what kind of size that group would make up and whether or not we could do anything with that group, And obviously, mostly it would be people on cell phones, which most of our interviewing is on cell phones. So, and any cell phone number in California is eligible to be called, so.
Right, and taking into account possibly the homeless population, which does not have a cell phone.
Yeah.
Small percentage, but still nonetheless, it's an interesting point with regard to
definitely.
Housing status and position on support of homelessness, whether homeowner, renter, or homeless.
Yeah, I agree.
Been a while since I've done any statistical analysis, but I noticed one of the charts that tends to bother me in California is with the crime issues and dealing with the law enforcement and the court system in general in California if you're not well-to-do. I noticed in there you have most likely or most of the time the police treat well. Numbers are about 60%. Mm-hmm. Am I to infer that the other 40% think it's poor? Would that be accurate?
Would be what? I'm sorry.
Would that be accurate for me to get to infer that 40% of the people that you are not listing, in other words, the graph shows most likely and likely, about 60%.
Yeah. Well, the other half of that.
What about the other 40%? Is that the poor side? Because the question infers poor was part of the analysis.
Poor is in like a question. The phrasing of it?
That the conduct of law enforcement toward the population was poor.
Yeah, so I think it's like almost always, most of the time, seldom, and never, I think.
That doesn't appear on the graph.
No, but everything is in our...
okay.
online and in our full report as well as crosstabs, just for kind of simplicity of being able to show it. We chose to kind of show those two categories, but all of the data, it's a 4 or 5, it's actually, I think, 4 red categories, and then there was the volunteered always, and then I think a volunteered never. And so there's the whole gambit of kind of options.
It depends on how you are engaged with law enforcement, whether you're a victim or whether you're a perpetrator, whether you're wealthy or whether you're poor, and whether you can afford counsel. And so it's just curious for me about, my experience has been difficult with it, trying to help people that are homeless, with the rousting and the difficulty of the experience, getting fined for money they don't have, not being able to sleep on the street because it's against the law, where do I sleep, kind of stuff. And law enforcement's forced to engage with that also, and they do not approve.
Yeah, and there's some interesting kind of court cases that are currently being worked through on those types of topics as well. Well, I'd like to thank everyone for coming today and for all the great questions and discussion. And we'll be coming back, I'm sure, later this spring for more chatting. So take care. Thank you.